Okay, we're going to cover chapter 16.4, which is about pieces of evidence of evolution. So we're going to first talk about biogeography. Biogeography is the study of where organisms live now and where they and their ancestors lived in the past. So two biogeographical patterns are significant to Charles Darwin's theory. The first is a pattern in which closely related species differentiate in slightly different climates, and the second is a pattern in which very distantly related species develop similarities in similar environments. So to Darwin, so like for closely related but different, to Darwin, the biogeography of the Galapagos species of finches suggested that populations on the island had evolved from mainland species. So from species that went from a mainland area and traveled to the islands of the Galapagos. Over time, natural selection on the islands produced variations among populations that resulted in different but closely related island species of finches. For example, natural selection produced variation in shell shape among the giant land tortoises that inhabit the islands. But then when you're looking at distantly related organisms that end up kind of similar, on the other hand, similar habitats around the world are often home to animals and plants that are only distantly related. Darwin noted that similar ground-dwelling birds inhabit similar grasslands in Europe, Australia, and Africa. Differences in body structures among those animals provide evidence that they evolved from different ancestors. Similarities among those animals, however, provide evidence that similar selection pressures had caused distantly related species to develop similar adaptations. So in regards to the age of the Earth, evolution takes a long time, which was seen through the fossil record. If life has evolved, then Earth must be very old. Two scientists, Hutton and Lyell, argued that Earth was indeed very old, but technology then, they couldn't really determine how old it was. However, now geologists use radioactivity with radioactive dating to establish the age of certain rocks and fossils. Radioactive dating indicates that Earth is about 4.5 or like 4.6 billion years old, plenty of time for evolution by natural selection to take place. Looking at recent fossils, Darwin's study of fossils had convinced him and other scientists that life evolved, but paleontologists of the 1859 hadn't found enough fossils of intermediate forms, which are like forms between going from one species to another. So it's the kind of the link that would be an intermediate form of life to document the evolution of modern species from their ancestors. Since Darwin, paleontologists have discovered hundreds of fossils that document intermediate stages in the evolution of many different groups of modern species. So for example, looking at the kind of evolution or descendants of whales from ancient land mammals, we're going to kind of take a look and see, based on fossil evidence, what kind of things happen to go from ancient land mammals to our common everyday whale. So the limb structures of the Ambulocetus, which means like the walking whale, suggests that these animals could both swim in shallow water and walk on land. So we had these limbs here for walking. And then the hind legs of the Rhinocetus, which they were short and probably not able to bear that much weight. So the limbs were starting to get shorter. Paleontologists think that these animals spent most of their time in the water, hence the shorter limbs. The Basilosaurus, the next round, had a streamlined body and reduced hind limbs. So you can see that the limbs are getting shorter here. These skeletal features suggest that Basilosaurus spent its entire life swimming in the ocean. Modern whales retain a reduced pelvic bones, so there's actually pelvic bones in whales, in some cases upper and lower limb bones. However, these structures no longer play a role in locomotion. So we see the progression of limbs getting shorter and shorter to indicate this relationship between ancestral land mammals to whales. Other recent fossils find connect the dots between dinosaurs and birds and between fish and four-legged land animals. All historical records, just in general for history, are incomplete, and the history of life is no exception to that. But the evidence we do have, however, tells an unmistakable story of evolutionary change. There's another way of looking for another piece of evidence of evolution is comparing anatomy and something called embryology. By Darwin's time, scientists had noticed that all vertebrate limbs had the same basic bone structure. For example, the front limbs of amphibians, there we go, reptiles like an alligator, birds like a chicken, and mammals contain the basic same bones. So Darwin proposed that animals with similar structures descended or evolved from a common ancestor with a basic version of that structure. Structures that are shared by related species and that have been inherited from a common ancestor we refer to as a homologous structure. So think of the prefix again, homo means same, so like same basic layout of a structure. Biologists test whether structures are homologous by studying anatomical details, the way structures develop in embryos, and the pattern in which they appeared over evolutionary history. So the limbs that we were looking at before evolved with modifications from the front limbs of a common ancestor whose bones resembled those of an ancient fish. Similarities and differences among homologous structures help determine how recently species shared a common ancestor. So for example, the front limbs of reptiles and birds are more similar to each other than either is to the front limb of like an amphibian or a mammal. So this similarity among many others indicates that the common ancestor of reptiles and birds lived more recently than the common ancestor of reptiles, birds, and mammals. Another clue here, the clue to common descent is common structure, not common function. So a bird's wing and a horse's front limb have different functions, but they have similar structures. But body parts that share a common function but not structure are called analogous structures. So like the wing of a bee and the wing of a bird are analogous structures, so that doesn't show relationship. Not all homologous structures have important functions. These are referred to as vestigial structures. These are inherited from ancestors but have lost much of all their original function due to the different selection pressures acting on the descendant. So, for example, the hip bones of bottlenose dolphins are vestigial structures. In their ancestors, hip bones played a role in terrestrial locomotion. However, as the dolphin lineage adapted to life at sea, this function was lost. Same thing with us with having goosebumps. Common ancestor had much more body hair and would have the goosebumps, the erector pili muscle and the goosebumps or in the skin push up the hair to either warm themselves or to scare off any sort of predator. And we actually still retain that erector pili muscle in our skin, but yet we don't have all the body hair that our common ancestors did. So why would an organism possess structures with little or no function? What's the point? Well, one possibility is that the presence of a vestigial structure does not affect an organism's fitness, which when we refer to fitness, we'll hear next unit, is how well something can survive and reproduce. So in that case, if there's no harm or foul towards an organism's fitness, natural selection is not going to eliminate it. It's not going to waste energy to eliminate something that won't help something survive more successfully. Embryology, researchers noticed a long time ago that the early developmental stages of many animals with backbones, called vertebrates, look very similar. Recent observations make clear that the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in the same patterns to produce many homologous tissues and organs in vertebrates. Similar patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that organisms have descended from a common ancestor. Evolutionary theory offers the most logical explanation for these similarities and patterns of development. Similar patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that organisms have descended from a common ancestor. So if you look at this picture of all these different organisms, very early on, so we have mammals on the right here, we have fish and birds and reptiles. We look very, very similar early on. Even in the middle here, the mammals look pretty much, can't really tell them apart. So showing that embryos look very similar at the beginning has a clue that we at some point came from common ancestors, to show that we have this basic overall body plan of how embryology kind of the process goes. Darwin had no idea how heredity worked, and he was worried that his lack of knowledge might prove fatal to his theory. As it happened, some of the strongest evidence supporting evolutionary theory comes from genetics. A long series of discoveries from Mendel to Watson and Crick to genomics helps explain how evolution actually works. Also, we now understand how mutation and the reshuffling of genes during sexual reproduction produce the heritability on which natural selection operates. So, one piece of evidence, all living cells use information coded in DNA and RNA to carry information from one generation to the next and to direct protein synthesis. DNA can be found again in the nuclei, mitochondria, and chloroplasts of organisms. So this universal genetic code is nearly identical in almost all organisms, including bacteria, yeast, plants, fungi, and animals. When you're looking at DNA, this section here, this compares a small portion of DNA from the same gene in 3 animals, a mouse, a whale, and a chicken. So you can kind of see overall, if you're looking at the sequence of bases, very, very, very similar between the 3, with some different, some changes between the 3 organisms, but overall, very, very similar. So this similarity is in genetic code is powerful evidence that all organisms evolved from common ancestors. In Darwin's day, biologists could only study similarities and differences in structures they could see, but physical body structures can't be used to compare mice with yeast or bacteria, obviously. Today, we know that homology is not just limited to physical structures. Homologous proteins share extensive structural and chemical similarities. So you can actually look at molecules like proteins. One homologous protein is cytochrome C, which functions in cellular respiration. Remarkably, similar versions of cytochrome C are found in almost all living cells, from cells in baker's yeast, that's in like bread, to cells in humans. Genes can be homologous too. So one example is a set of genes that determine your body plan, which are those Hox genes that we learned last semester. They help determine the head to tail axes in embryonic development. So in vertebrates, sets of homologous Hox genes direct the growth of front and hind limbs. Small changes in these genes can produce dramatic changes in the structures they control. Relatively minor changes in these genes can produce major changes in organism structures and the structure of its descendants. At least some homologous Hox genes are found in almost all multicellular animals, from fruit flies to humans. So that's why we learned, like last semester, we're about like 85% related to a mouse, yet we look fairly different, but it's a lot to do with the Hox genes that we share. One way to gather evidence for evolutionary change is to observe natural selection in action. So one of the best examples of natural selection in action comes from observations of animals living in their natural environment, the Galapagos finches. So Darwin hypothesized that the Galapagos finches he observed had descended from a common ancestor. He noted that several finch species have beaks of very different sizes and shapes. Each species uses its beak like a specialized tool to pick up and handle its food. Different types of foods are most easily handled with beaks of different sizes and shapes. Darwin proposed that natural selection had shaped the beaks of different bird populations as they became adapted to eat different foods. No one thought there was a way to really test that hypothesis until these 2 scientists, Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University, came along. So these are the 2 basic finches that we're going to be looking at, tree finches and ground finches, and looking at how their beaks handle different food and environments. The Grants realized that Darwin's hypothesis rested on 2 testable assumptions. First, for beak size and shape to evolve, there must be enough heritable variation in those traits to provide raw material for natural selection. Second, differences in beak size and shape must produce differences in fitness, which means how well something can survive and how much it can reproduce. All right, we're going to have to do a part 2 here. Part 2 will be very, very short. All right, stay tuned.